Vincent J. Speranza was born in 1,925 inches, New York City, into a working-class Italian immigrant family at a time when America itself was struggling to survive. He grew up in a tightly knit neighborhood where families shared little money but strong values, hard work, discipline, and loyalty to one another. Like many children of immigrants, Vincent learned early that nothing was given for free. His parents had arrived in the United States with almost nothing except the hope that this country would offer their children a better future. Vincent's childhood unfolded during the Great Depression, an era marked by unemployment, hunger, and uncertainty. Yet even in those harsh years, he remembered life as structured and meaningful. School mattered, respect mattered, responsibility mattered. He was a good student, occasionally mischievous like any boy his age, but never truly reckless. Teachers disciplined him when needed, and family expectations kept him grounded. Growing up Italian in New York during the 1,930 seconds meant learning resilience through daily life. Families relied on one another. Fathers worked long hours, mothers held households together, and children were taught to endure hardship without complaint. These early experiences quietly shaped Vincent's character, preparing him, without his knowing it, for trials far greater than childhood poverty. By the time he reached his teenage years, the world beyond his neighborhood was already sliding toward chaos. Although Vincent could not yet imagine battlefields, frozen forests, or machine gun fire, the foundation of who he would become, a soldier capable of enduring the unimaginable, was already being formed in those early years of hardship, discipline, and family honor. Everything changed for Vincent Speranza in December 1941. He was only 16 years old when the news of Pearl Harbor shattered the ordinary rhythm of American life. That Sunday, while riding his bicycle through the neighborhood, Vincent sensed something was wrong. A local store had gone silent. The radio was on. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was speaking. When Vincent rushed home, his father turned up the volume just in time for them to hear the words that would define a generation. A state of war exists between the Empire of Japan and the United States of America. The room fell still. For immigrant families like the Speranzas, this moment carried a weight deeper than politics or headlines. Vincent's father, who had come to America from Italy with nothing, gathered his 4 sons. He did not shout. He did not dramatize. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction. America, he told them, had given their family everything: work, dignity, a home, and a future their homeland could not. This country had opened its doors when they had nowhere else to go. Then came the sentence Vincent would carry with him for the rest of his life: this country must not fail. His father knew he was too old to fight, but he expected his sons to be ready when the time came. The boys immediately began asking how they could enlist, even trying to pass themselves off as older than they were. They were turned away, but the seed had been planted. From that day forward, the war was no longer distant. It was personal. For Vincent Speranza, Pearl Harbor transformed boyhood into responsibility and patriotism into a promise he fully intended to keep. After Pearl Harbor, Vincent Speranza wanted only one thing: to join the fight. Like thousands of young Americans, he felt an urgent pull toward the uniform, a belief that history was calling and that he could not sit on the sidelines. But there was one obstacle: he could not outrun his age. At 16, then 17, Vincent was still legally a boy, even though his sense of duty told him otherwise. He and his brothers tried anyway. They let the sparse hairs on their faces grow, borrowed their father's fedora hats, and walked into the recruiting office claiming they were 18. The sergeant barely looked at them before telling them to go home and come back when they were telling the truth. There was no anger in the rejection, only impatience. The war was real, but so were the rules. For Vincent, the wait was agonizing. Every month felt stolen. Europe was burning, the Pacific was exploding, and young men barely older than him were already fighting and dying. Finally, on the 23rd of March, 1943, the day he turned 18, Vincent registered for the draft. Even then, nothing happened immediately. In those days, enlistment was not simply a choice. Cities were given quotas, and names were called when the time came. Months passed. Then, in October 1943, the call finally arrived. Vincent Speranza was going to the U.S. Army. The long wait was over. The boy who had been turned away was now officially a soldier in waiting, about to step onto a path that would carry him from training fields in America to the frozen killing grounds of Europe. Vincent Speranza finally wore the uniform, but war was still far away. Instead of battle, he was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Army began stripping boys down and rebuilding them into infantrymen. The training was brutal, relentless, and unapologetic. A master sergeant greeted the new recruits with raw authority, making it clear that hesitation, comfort, and individuality had no place here. Orders were shouted, fear was introduced early, and discipline was absolute. The first phase lasted 19 weeks, long days of marching, weapons drills, physical punishment, and constant correction. The young soldiers learned how to shoot, move, obey, and endure. They were exhausted, bruised, and often confused, but they were also eager. Each graduation ceremony felt like it should be the end, the moment they would finally be sent to war. Each time, it wasn't. After infantry school came advanced infantry training. When that ended, they were told to return for heavy weapons training. Mortars, machine guns, and crew-served weapons replaced rifles. The cycle repeated itself. Train harder, wait longer. For Vincent and men like him, the frustration grew. Germany was overrunning Europe. Japan was advancing across the Pacific, and yet they were still drilling on American soil. Every delay felt unbearable. They didn't want comfort or safety, they wanted purpose. The young infantrymen were ready to test themselves against the enemy, convinced that training was only meaningful once it was paid for in combat. What they didn't yet understand was that this endless preparation was quietly shaping the instincts and endurance that would later decide who lived and who didn't. The moment that changed Vincent Speranza's path came without warning. One day, the recruits were ordered to sit in a wide open field and told to watch 3 C-47 transport planes roared overhead, their doors opening mid-flight. One by one, soldiers threw themselves into empty space. Seconds later, white parachutes blossomed across the sky, drifting down with an eerie calm. The men hit the ground, rolled, gathered their chutes, and ran forward at full speed. For Vincent, it was unforgettable. A captain stepped forward and introduced the United States Parachute Corps. These were not ordinary infantrymen, he said. Paratroopers entered the battlefield in a way no other soldiers did, by jumping straight into the fight. Then came the final detail. Volunteers would receive $50 extra a month. That part barely mattered. What mattered was the challenge, the danger, and the chance to stop waiting. Vincent raised his hand. Jump school was unlike anything he had experienced. The training was intense, designed to push men past what they believed were their physical and mental limits. Instructors drilled aggression, confidence, and total commitment into every recruit. They taught not only how to fight, but how to keep moving when the body screamed to quit. Vincent learned that fear did not disappear, it was controlled. For a young soldier desperate to reach the front lines, becoming a paratrooper felt like choosing the hardest road forward. It was risky, exhausting, and unforgiving, but it promised action instead of delay. By volunteering for the Parachute Corps, Vincent Speranza stepped closer to war and unknowingly toward the moment that would define his life forever. Paratrooper training did more than prepare Vincent Speranza's body for combat. It reshaped his mind. Jump school was designed to break men down and rebuild them with discipline, precision, and an unshakable refusal to quit. Every day, push recruits beyond what they believed were their limits, teaching them a simple but brutal truth. When you think you are finished, you are not. That lesson would later decide who lived and who died. The physical demands were relentless. Long runs, exhausting drills, and repeated practice of parachute landing falls hardened the body against injury. Soldiers learned how to hit the ground without breaking bones, how to roll, absorb impact, and get moving instantly. But physical strength alone was never enough. The real test was mental. Fear was constant, fear of heights, fear of failure, fear of the jump itself. Training did not eliminate fear, it taught control. Discipline and attention to detail were drilled into every recruit. Vincent learned how to pack his own parachute, knowing that the first jump would be made with equipment he prepared himself. Every fold, every strap, every knot mattered. One mistake could mean death. That awareness created a level of focus few civilians ever experience. Instructors reminded them constantly, training was not punishment, it was survival. In combat, there would be no second chances, no time to think things through slowly. What saved lives was muscle memory, discipline, and the refusal to give up. By the end of jump school, Vincent Speranza was no longer just a soldier. He had learned how to endure, how to obey under pressure, and how to keep going when quitting seemed easier. Fear became a constant companion during parachute training, but it was never treated as weakness. Vincent Speranza learned early that survival depended on mastering fear rather than denying it. One of the most critical skills drilled into every paratrooper was the parachute landing fall, known as the PLF. This technique taught soldiers how to hit the ground safely, feet together, knees bent, rolling through the body to absorb impact. A bad landing could shatter bones or end a soldier's war before it began. But nothing matched the tension of learning to pack one's own parachute. In jump school, recruits were told plainly, your first jump will be made using the parachute you packed yourself. The message was unmistakable, your life rests in your own hands. Every fold of fabric, every strap, every knot demanded absolute attention. The classroom fell silent during parachute packing sessions. No one joked, no one rushed. The real strain came afterward. Parachutes were packed on Friday, the jump happened on Monday. That meant an entire weekend filled with doubt. Did I fold it correctly? Did I miss something? Is one small mistake waiting to kill me? There was no way to check again. Trust had to replace certainty. When the day arrived, bravado hid anxiety, but inside every man understood the risk. Stepping toward the open aircraft door meant trusting training, discipline, and the parachute packed by trembling hands days earlier. In that moment, fear sharpened focus. Survival depended not on courage alone, but on preparation, patience, and the ability to act despite terror. As Vincent Speranza prepared for his first parachute jump, fear gave way to memory. Standing in the aircraft, checking straps and connections, his mind drifted back to a quiet moment years earlier, his father walking him to the train station before he left for the Army. His father had said almost nothing until the final words that mattered most, "Son, don't do anything that will make me hang my head in shame." Those words returned now, clear and heavy. As Vincent stood near the open door, when the command came, Hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. Then he stepped into empty space. For an instant, there was nothing, no ground, no support, only the terrifying silence of free fall. The body reacted before the mind could catch up. Panic surged, but training held firm. Then the static line pulled, the parachute deployed, and the shock passed. Suddenly, everything changed. The violent rush faded, replaced by a strange calm. The parachute opened fully above him, wide and beautiful, and Vincent felt as if he had been gently lifted and cradled. The fear dissolved into awe. Below him, the earth rose steadily, no longer an enemy but a destination. When his boots finally hit the ground and he completed the landing roll, Vincent looked up in disbelief. He was alive. He had done it. In that moment, pride replaced fear, not pride and courage alone, but pride in discipline, obedience, and honoring the words of his father. Night jump training revealed the most unforgiving truth of parachute warfare. One small mistake could cost a life. Darkness changed everything. Depth perception vanished. Familiar landmarks became deceptive shadows, and fear sharpened into something colder and more dangerous. Paratroopers were taught that night jumps demanded absolute discipline because instinct alone could betray them. During one such jump, tragedy struck. 2 trainees mistook a concrete highway for a river glistening under moonlight. In training, soldiers were taught that if landing in water, they must loosen their harness and release the parachute just before impact to avoid being dragged under. Believing they were above water, the men followed the procedure. They let go of their parachutes too early. They hit concrete. Neither survived. The accident stunned everyone. Until that moment, training had felt brutal but controlled. This incident shattered any illusion of safety. It proved that courage meant nothing without precision, and confidence could become fatal if it overruled discipline. The margin between survival and death was measured in seconds, feet, and decisions made under stress. For Vincent Speranza, the lesson cut deep. The training was no longer theoretical, it was real. Every instruction, every warning, every repeated drill suddenly carried weight. The death of those men became a permanent reminder that war did not forgive errors. From that point forward, every jump was approached with quiet seriousness. No jokes, no shortcuts, no assumptions. Night jumps taught Vincent that survival was not about luck or bravery alone. It was about attention to detail, respect for training, and understanding that in war, being wrong even by a little could mean never coming home. Vincent Speranza's journey to war truly began when he crossed the Atlantic aboard the Queen Mary. Once a luxury ocean liner, the massive ship had been converted into a troop transport packed with thousands of young American soldiers headed toward an uncertain future. The voyage was fast and tense, driven by the constant threat of German submarines. There was no escort, no zigzagging convoy, only speed and silence across dark waters. For Vincent, the crossing felt like a one-way passage from training into reality. They landed in Britain after several days at sea, disembarking far from enemy-controlled waters before being moved by smaller ships and trains into England. Camps awaited them, filled with rumors, briefings, and an unspoken understanding. This was no longer preparation. Europe was already burning. The news they received was sobering. The 101st Airborne Division, legendary for its role in Normandy, had recently been shattered during Operation Market Garden in Holland. What was meant to be a bold, war-ending maneuver had turned into a costly failure. Thousands of paratroopers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was lost. Morale was shaken. Vincent and the men arriving with him were not celebrated heroes, they were replacements. They were being sent to fill the gaps left by dead and missing soldiers. Every empty bunk and silent name carried a warning. They were stepping into a division that had already paid heavily for victory. As winter closed in and orders came down, Vincent understood that he was no longer training for war. He was inheriting it cold, unfinished, and unforgiving. By December 1944, many believed the war in Europe was nearing its end. Winter had arrived, and with it came a dangerous sense of optimism among the Allies. That illusion was shattered when Germany launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, a region considered too rough and quiet for large-scale operations. The attack would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Unknown to Allied commanders at the front, the Germans had secretly assembled an enormous force, 25 divisions, including elite panzer units, equipped with some of their newest and heaviest tanks, were concentrated for a single decisive strike. Adolf Hitler's objective was bold and desperate: break through the Allied lines, cross Belgium, and seize the port of Antwerp. Capturing Antwerp would sever Allied supply routes, split British and American forces, and potentially force a negotiated end to the war on German terms. Standing in the way of this plan was a small Belgian town named Bastogne. On the map, it appeared insignificant, but strategically, it was vital. Bastogne sat at the crossroads of multiple major roads and rail lines. Any army moving toward Antwerp needed control of this hub. Without Bastogne, German armor could not advance or resupply effectively. As German forces surged forward, Bastogne became the key to the entire offensive. Whoever held the town controlled the movement of men, fuel, and weapons in the region. For Vincent Speranza and the 101st Airborne Division, orders were clear and urgent: move immediately and hold Bastogne at all costs. What followed would test the limits of endurance, courage, and survival in one of the coldest and most brutal battles of the war. The order to move came suddenly in the dark hours before dawn. There was no time for briefings, no time to prepare properly. The 101st Airborne Division was told to drop everything and move immediately to Bastogne. They were not jumping into battle this time. They were being rushed forward by truck straight into the path of a massive German offensive. For many of the young paratroopers, including Vincent Speranza, confusion and disbelief filled the barracks. Bastogne was far north, the roads were icy, and winter had settled in with brutal force. The reality of the march quickly became clear. Many soldiers were not fully equipped. Some lacked helmets, others had no rifles or machine guns. Winter clothing was scarce, and most men still wore light uniforms meant for warmer weather. Food and water were limited, and sleep was almost non-existent. The trucks rolled on for hours through freezing darkness, packed tightly with exhausted men, tempers flaring as bodies stiffened from cold and hunger. When they finally arrived in Bastogne, the situation was worse than anyone expected. The town was in chaos, filled with retreating units, wounded soldiers, and civilians fleeing in every direction. Fires burned in the streets as men tried desperately to warm their hands. The paratroopers stepped off the trucks cold, hungry, and drained, but the fight had already begun. There would be no rest. Bastogne had to be held, and the 101st would have to do it with whatever they had, or die trying. As the 101st Airborne pushed into Bastogne, the full scale of the collapse around them became impossible to ignore. Units from other American divisions, broken, exhausted, and bloodied, were retreating through the town after being smashed by the initial German assault. These men were moving rearward in disorder, carrying the scars of battles already lost. For the paratroopers, this chaos became a grim opportunity for survival. Vincent Speranza remembered that many of his own men arrived with little more than trench knives or empty hands. Rifles, machine guns, ammunition, belts, everything was in short supply. There was no supply depot waiting, no organized rearmament. Instead, weapons had to be found wherever they could be. As retreating soldiers passed through Bastogne, the paratroopers approached them directly. Sometimes they asked, sometimes they simply took what was needed. A rifle lifted from a tired shoulder, a machine gun exchanged for a promise to hold the line. These moments were not acts of theft, but of necessity. In war, survival often depends on adaptability. What mattered was not who originally carried the weapon, but who would stand and fight with it next. By the time the 101st moved into their positions outside the town, many paratroopers were armed only because they had scavenged under pressure, making life or death decisions in the middle of confusion. Those improvised choices would soon mean the difference between holding Bastogne or watching it fall. Tuan Phong Tu Do Tien. Colonel Yule Tu Dong Ten Kong Chandik. Tao Tor Jian. Lup Bong Phong Tu Speranza Nyen Man Buk Nai Jup Jo Bastogne. Once the perimeter around Bastogne was roughly established, the real physical torture began. The men of the 101st Airborne were ordered to dig foxholes in ground that had frozen solid. Shovels bounced off the earth as if striking stone. Every swing sent shock through frozen hands and exhausted shoulders. For machine gun crews like Vincent Speranza's, the task was even worse. A proper position required a two-man hole deep enough to protect both gunner and assistant, yet the frozen soil refused to yield. Hours passed as the men hacked and hammered at the ground, sweating despite the bitter cold. Just as a shallow hole was finally carved out, another order came down the line: move, dig again. Positions shifted repeatedly as commanders adjusted the defensive layout, each relocation erasing hours of painful effort. Bodies grew weaker, fingers numb, tempers frayed. Hunger and dehydration took their toll, but there was no choice. The digging had to continue. By the early hours of morning, many soldiers reached the edge of total exhaustion. Strength ran out, tools were dropped. In some places, foxholes were never finished at all. Men scraped away snow with their hands, lay flat against the frozen ground, and accepted whatever cover they could get. Speranza later said that at that point, youth and training meant nothing, only survival. Bastogne would not be held by comfort or preparation, but by men who refused to quit, even when their bodies had nothing left to give. Morning arrived under a blanket of thick fog, clinging low to the frozen ground in front of Bastogne. Visibility was almost non-existent, and for hours the men of the 101st Airborne could only wait, listening. Then, slowly, the fog began to lift, first in thin layers, then in wide sheets, revealing the battlefield ahead. What emerged was terrifying. Across an open, snow-covered field, German tanks were advancing, their engines growling, followed closely by waves of infantry, moving with confidence and momentum. The German forces believed they were facing broken resistance. They had crushed multiple American divisions already and expected the same result here. Vincent Speranza and his machine gun crew lay motionless in their shallow positions, weapons trained forward, hearts pounding. Orders came down the line: hold fire, let them come closer. As the enemy crossed the open ground, the distance closed 500 yards, then 450. Finally, at the critical moment, the lieutenant gave the command: wait until 400 yards. Then, now. Everything erupted at once. Machine guns, rifles, and artillery tore into the advancing German troops. The open field became a killing zone. Snow turned dark with blood as infantry fell in rows, caught completely exposed. Without infantry support, the German tanks were forced to pull back. The assault collapsed under the sudden violence. That single moment disciplined restraint followed by overwhelming fire stopped the enemy cold. Speranza would remember it as the instant when Bastogne did not fall, when the line held against impossible odds. After the initial German assault was broken at the front line, another factor proved decisive in keeping Bastogne from falling: artillery. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who found himself the senior commander on the ground almost by circumstance, understood that firepower, not numbers, would decide the battle. Though surrounded and undersupplied, the 101st Airborne still possessed one critical advantage: well-coordinated artillery. McAuliffe ordered the guns positioned with flexibility in mind. Instead of fixing them to a single direction, he ensured they could rapidly shift fire to any threatened sector of the perimeter. This allowed American artillery to concentrate overwhelming force at precise points where German armor or infantry attempted to break through. Whenever enemy tanks emerged or infantry massed for another push, artillery fire followed almost immediately. The effect was devastating. German units that had advanced confidently suddenly found themselves under crushing bombardment. Tanks were slowed, disrupted, or forced to withdraw. Infantry formations broke apart under explosions they could neither predict nor escape. According to Vincent Speranza, McAuliffe's use of artillery felt like an invisible shield, one that appeared exactly when it was needed most. In the freezing forests around Bastogne, artillery became the great equalizer. It compensated for shortages in men, weapons, and supplies. Each accurate barrage bought more time, preserved the perimeter, and drained the momentum of the German offensive. Without McAuliffe's disciplined control of firepower, Bastogne would not have survived the siege that followed. As the fighting intensified, the situation around Bastogne grew even more desperate. German forces completed their encirclement, sealing off all roads into the town. With the perimeter closed, the 101st Airborne was officially surrounded. Supplies could no longer get in, and wounded men could no longer be evacuated out. What followed was not only a military crisis, but a medical catastrophe. During the encirclement, German troops overran the American field hospital outside Bastogne. Beds, blankets, medicine, and morphine fell into enemy hands. Many of the medical personnel were captured or killed, leaving the defenders with almost nothing. Inside the town, the medical situation collapsed. There was no functioning hospital left, no stock of supplies, and no organized system to care for the wounded. Incredibly, the entire defense of Bastogne was left with only one American doctor and one Belgian nurse. They worked in shattered buildings, often church floors and cellars, treating men laid side by side on cold stone. There were no proper instruments, no anesthesia, and almost no bandages. Curtains, bed sheets, and torn clothing became makeshift dressings. Vincent Speranza later described the scene as one of the most haunting moments of the siege. Men who had survived artillery and machine gun fire now lay helpless, fighting infection, shock, and exposure. The encirclement had turned Bastogne into a test not just of combat endurance, but of human compassion under unimaginable strain. Amid the cold, blood, and chaos of the siege, one small act of humanity became a story that would outlive the war itself. Vincent Speranza's close friend, Joe Willis, had been wounded by shrapnel and lay among dozens of injured soldiers on the stone floor of a church being used as a makeshift hospital. The building offered shelter, but little else. There were no supplies, no heat, and almost nothing to ease the pain. When Speranza leaned down to check on him, Joe made a simple request: "Go find me something to drink." At first, the request seemed impossible. Bastogne was surrounded, cut off from supplies, and under constant artillery fire. Taverns had been bombed, streets were dangerous, and survival alone felt uncertain. Still, Speranza went out into the snow and rubble, moving from one destroyed bar to another. In the second tavern he entered, something unbelievable happened. The beer tap still worked. With no bottles or containers to carry it, Speranza took off his steel helmet, filled it with beer, and hurried back through the shelling. Inside the church, wounded men sat up as he arrived. One sip led to another. Laughter briefly replaced pain. He returned for more until a medical officer stopped him sharply, warning that men with chest or stomach wounds could not drink. Cold, wet, and reprimanded, Speranza went back to his foxhole. The beer run was over, but in that moment, morale mattered as much as medicine. When the war finally ended and Vincent Speranza returned home, he was no longer the 18-year-old boy who had left New York. He was 20 years old, hardened by combat and shaped by experiences few civilians could understand. Standing in his mother's house, looking at himself in the mirror, Speranza made a private decision that would define the next 6 decades of his life. He told himself that he would not become one of the broken men he had seen in stories and films, soldiers haunted by nightmares, consumed by rage, or unable to return to normal life. Instead, he chose to seal the war away. He did not deny what had happened, but he locked it deep inside, refusing to let it control him. The memories of frozen foxholes, shattered bodies, and relentless fear were placed behind an emotional door and left there. Speranza returned to civilian life with discipline and determination. He married, started a family, and built a career as a school teacher, dedicating himself to education and stability rather than violence. For 65 years, he avoided military organizations, veterans groups, and commemorations. He did not attend reunions or ceremonies. To him, the war was over, and he believed that constantly reliving it would only reopen wounds. This deliberate separation allowed him to live fully as a civilian, but it also meant carrying a silent weight alone. The past remained intact, untouched, waiting for the moment it would eventually resurface. At the age of 85, Vincent Speranza faced a loss that reopened everything he had kept buried for decades. His wife, the woman he had shared nearly his entire adult life with, was slipping away into Alzheimer's disease. As her condition worsened, he was forced to make the painful decision to place her permanently in a nursing home. For Speranza, this moment shattered the structure that had supported him since the war. She had been his anchor, his future, and his reason to keep moving forward. Without her beside him, the quiet became unbearable. He found himself drifting into despair, sitting alone and waiting, as he later described it, to die. The discipline that had once allowed him to lock away the past now left him defenseless against grief. The war memories, long sealed, pressed against the walls he had built. Then, by chance, a brief encounter changed everything. While out in public, he met a woman who recognized his connection to World War II and spoke to him about Bastogne. She told him that the people there had never forgotten the 101st Airborne, that monuments stood in their honor, that ceremonies were still held, and that the American dead were remembered with gratitude. At first, Speranza resisted the idea. He had spent a lifetime avoiding the past, but something shifted. He realized that returning to Bastogne was not about reopening wounds. It was about paying respect. If nothing else, he owed that to the men who never came home. That realization marked a turning point, the moment when memory stopped being a burden and became a path forward. When Vincent Speranza finally returned to Bastogne, he expected distance, not recognition. He believed the landscape would be unrecognizable after 7 decades, that whatever had once existed there belonged only to history, but the past was waiting for him. On his first day in town, a chance encounter led him to a Dutch paratrooper officer, someone who had studied the battle in detail. When the officer learned that Speranza had served with the 101st Airborne, His reaction was immediate and reverent. This was not curiosity, it was respect. The officer insisted on taking Speranza out of town to the old battlefield. As they drove through peaceful countryside, Speranza saw nothing familiar, no snow, no smoke, no chaos. Then they stopped on a ridge. The officer stepped out, pointed across the ground, and calmly began describing where each company of the 101st had dug in during the first German assault. Then he turned, looked directly at Speranza, and pointed to a specific spot. "That was your foxhole." Speranza froze. He demanded to know how this man could possibly be certain. The answer cut through him. Using an after-action report sketched decades earlier by Speranza's own company commander, drawn on cardboard from a K-ration box, the officer had reconstructed the defensive layout. Speranza had been the only machine gunner in that platoon. The map led straight to him. Standing there at 85, in the exact place where he had once waited as a 19-year-old for the first German attack, the walls finally collapsed. The memories he had locked away for a lifetime came rushing back. He broke down, overwhelmed by the realization that the ground had remembered him even when he had tried to forget it. As Vincent Speranza reconnected with his past, he discovered something both surprising and deeply ironic. In Europe, he was famous not for his combat record, but for a helmet filled with beer. During his return to Bastogne, friends took him to a cafe and placed bottles on the table bearing a familiar image. The label showed a paratrooper raising a steel helmet overflowing with beer. Alongside it were small ceramic bowls shaped like GI helmets. The beer was called Airborne beer, inspired by a story many had once assumed was only a wartime myth. For years, Europeans had shared the tale of an anonymous American paratrooper who carried beer in his helmet to wounded soldiers during the siege of Bastogne. A Belgian brewer eventually turned that legend into a tribute, believing it symbolized courage mixed with humanity. When Speranza admitted he was the soldier behind the story, disbelief turned into celebration. What had once been dismissed as exaggeration suddenly became living history. The story spread quickly. Newspapers ran interviews, photographs appeared online, and videos circulated across the internet. Invitations followed from military bases, ceremonies, and commemorations across Europe and the United States. Speranza found himself recognized in public, not for the machine gun he fired or the medals he earned, but for a moment of compassion under fire. In a strange way, the helmet of beer became his true legacy. It reminded people that war is remembered not only through battles and strategy, but through small human acts that preserve dignity when everything else is lost. At an age when most people slow down, Vincent Speranza did something entirely unexpected. He became an author. At 89 years old, encouraged by his family and friends, he finally agreed to put his life story into words. For decades, he had insisted that writing a book was for educated professionals, people trained in universities to craft dialogue and structure. He believed he lacked those skills. What changed his mind was a simple realization: he did not need to invent anything. He only needed to tell the truth. Because typing was difficult, Speranza turned to technology. Using a voice recognition program called Dragon Naturally Speaking, he spoke into a microphone while the computer transcribed his words. The method suited him perfectly. He was a storyteller by nature, and speaking allowed his memories to flow naturally, just as he had always shared them with others. Sentence by sentence, the locked door to the past opened fully. The book was published in 2015 and quickly found an audience. Readers connected with its honesty, humor, and humanity, especially the balance between brutal combat and small acts of kindness. The book sold thousands of copies and continues to circulate among veterans, historians, and younger generations. For Speranza, writing was not about fame or profit, it was an act of release. By telling his story aloud, he ensured that the voices of those who never came home would be carried forward long after his own voice fell silent. At 95 years old, Vincent Speranza refused to fade quietly into history. Instead of slowing down, he embraced life with the same determination that had once carried him through war. Each year, he returned to Europe multiple times, traveling between Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne. These journeys were no longer painful pilgrimages, but celebrations of memory, survival, and friendship. He stood at ceremonies honoring the fallen, shook hands with young soldiers, and laughed with old friends who shared stories only time could soften. Away from formal events, Speranza enjoyed the simple pleasures he had earned. He drank beer, smoked cigars, and spent long evenings talking with people who understood what those places truly meant. To them, he was not just a veteran or a symbol of history, he was a living connection to it. His presence reminded others that courage does not end when the fighting stops, and that life, even after immense loss, can still be lived with joy. Speranza often said he did not know how much time he had left, but he knew how he wanted to spend it moving, remembering, and connecting. His story did not end with medals or battles, but with gratitude. In the end, he raised an imaginary glass, offering a simple toast, not to war, but to peace, to friendship, and to all the good people of the world who carry history forward by living well.